The courtroom hums with low murmurs, the air thick with quiet judgment. A polished mahogany bench looms at the front, where the judge hasn't yet arrived. The HOA's legal team sits smugly at their table, exchanging smirks. Their leader, Richard Calloway, a man with salt and pepper hair and an air of corporate arrogance, leans back in his chair, exuding the quiet confidence of someone who's used to getting his way. I squeeze my son's hand beneath the table. Ethan, my 15-year-old, sits beside me, his expression unreadable. He's dressed in a crisp navy suit, hands folded neatly in his lap. His dark curls are carefully combed, his posture perfect. Only I can tell he's nervous, the way his fingers tap in a precise rhythm against his knee, counting. They think he's just a disabled kid, an easy target. I glance across the room at the HOA board members, their eyes flicking toward us like we're an inconvenience, something to be dealt with and dismissed. They don't know the truth yet. They have no idea who they're dealing with. Our neighborhood, Westbrook Estates, has always been the kind of place that prides itself on exclusivity. A pristine, gated community lined with towering oak trees, white picket fences, and picture-perfect lawns. The kind of place where neighbors nod politely but never truly welcome you. Where families who belong have generational wealth, and those who don't are merely tolerated. When we moved in 5 years ago, we knew we were different. I'm a single black mother, and Ethan, brilliant, meticulous Ethan, was diagnosed with autism at a young age. He doesn't socialize the way they expect, doesn't fit their mold of an acceptable neighbor. He prefers order, structure, logic. And, most of all, he sees right through hypocrisy. 4 years, we followed the rules. We kept our house immaculate, paid our dues on time, and never made trouble. But that didn't stop the subtle slights. The way our complaints about broken streetlights were ignored, while another homeowner's concern about a mailbox being an inch too high was immediately addressed. The condescending tones at HOA meetings. The constant mistakes in our billing statements, always demanding extra fees. And then, the final insult, the lawsuit. A ridiculous, fabricated claim that we'd violated community codes by modifying our home without permission. The so-called violation. The wheelchair ramp we installed for Ethan's late grandmother, which had stood untouched for over 2 years. They claimed it was an eyesore, lowering property values. But we knew the truth. This wasn't about a ramp. It was about power. About making sure we knew our place. And now, here we are. In court. As the judge's door creaks open, silence falls over the room. I take a deep breath, steadying myself. This is it. They think today will be a simple win for them. A quick case. An easy victory. They have no idea what's coming. The first time I realized something was off, it was subtle. A letter slipped into our mailbox, not the standard HOA notice, but an official legal document. Cease and desist. A demand to remove the wheelchair ramp within 30 days or face fines and possible legal action. I frowned at the letter, scanning the HOA bylaws. Nowhere did it say anything about ramps being prohibited. It was an accessibility modification, well within federal housing laws. But something about the wording felt personal. I took it to the next HOA meeting, expecting a simple misunderstanding. Instead, I walked into a trap. The Westbrook Estates HOA meetings were held in the country club, a place Ethan and I never visited unless we had to. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged whiskey and polished leather. The room was filled with the usual crowd, homeowners in tailored blazers, designer watches glinting under the chandeliers. Conversations hushed as I entered, the way they always did. At the center of it all sat Richard Calloway, the HOA president. He gave me that practiced empty smile, one I'd seen countless times from men like him. The kind that barely concealed the condescension underneath. "Ah, Miss Carter," he said, not bothering to stand. "What can we do for you?" I placed the letter on the table. "I got this notice about my ramp. I'd like to know why." A few board members exchanged glances. Calloway sighed, shaking his head as if I were being difficult. "I understand your concern. But we have rules in place for a reason. The ramp wasn't approved by the board." I kept my voice steady. "It was installed 2 years ago." No one said a word. "Yes, well," Calloway folded his hands, "the community has certain aesthetic standards to uphold. Home values are very important here. There it was. Aesthetic standards. A phrase I'd heard too many times, always weaponized against people like me. I scanned the room, catching the way some of the members averted their eyes. Others, like Calloway's right-hand woman, Margaret Tinsley, wore open disdain on their faces. Margaret, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, leaned forward. "I'm sure you understand, Miss Carter. Some of our residents feel that certain modifications don't align with the community's vision." Certain modifications. I clenched my jaw. It's a wheelchair ramp. My mother needed it. Margaret didn't even blink. And now she's passed, hasn't she? The room fell silent. My fingers curled into fists. I looked to the other board members, waiting for someone, anyone, to object. No one did. That's when I knew. This wasn't about a ramp. This was about making an example of me. Of Ethan. Of the fact that no matter how quiet we were, how much we followed the rules, they still didn't want us here. I walked out of that meeting with a sinking feeling in my gut. And the next week, when I found a court summons taped to my door, I knew this was only the beginning. The court summons sat heavy in my hands. A lawsuit. The HOA was officially suing me for unauthorized modifications that diminished the aesthetic integrity of the community. They were serious. I spent the next few days combing through every HOA bylaw, every legal precedent I could find. There was no rule against ramps. No clause, no fine print, nothing. This lawsuit wasn't about compliance, it was about control. So I did what any rational person would do. I confronted them. The next HOA board meeting was in full swing when I arrived. Unlike before, I wasn't alone this time. I brought Ethan. He walked beside me, his strides measured, his suit perfectly pressed. He didn't say a word as we entered, but I could feel his mind working, analyzing, cataloging every reaction in the room. Calloway and Margaret sat at the head of the table, their expressions carefully neutral, until they saw Ethan. A flicker of something passed over Calloway's face, but he smoothed it away quickly. "Miss Carter," he said, clasping his hands together, "we weren't expecting you tonight." I placed the lawsuit on the table. "We need to talk." Margaret gave a tight smile. "If this is about the lawsuit, I'm afraid that matter is now in the hands of the court." Ethan tapped the paper with his fingers, scanning the text. "You cited Bylaw 14B as the violation," he said softly. Margaret's lips pursed. "Yes, that's correct." Ethan looked up. 14B applies only to structural changes that obstruct shared property. Our ramp is on private property. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Calloway barely blinked. Regardless, the HOA reserves the right to enforce uniformity within the community. Ethan nodded, his expression blank. Then why were 6 other homes approved for modifications in the past year, without board review? Silence. Margaret's fingers tightened on her pen. "That information is irrelevant." "Is it?" Ethan turned to the board members. "Because I found multiple instances where homeowners received verbal approval for fences, porches, even an entire sunroom." He paused. "And every single one of them had something in common." The silence deepened. They weren't black. A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Calloway sighed, rubbing his temples as if he were the victim in all this. "This is nonsense," he muttered. "We don't tolerate baseless accusations." Ethan leaned forward. "Then why was our complaint about a broken streetlight ignored for 8 months, while a report about a loud vehicle was addressed in 2 days?" Margaret bristled. "Are you implying we are discriminatory?" Ethan didn't blink. "I'm implying the numbers speak for themselves." Calloway's smile thinned. "This isn't a debate. The lawsuit stands." I exhaled slowly. "Then I hope you're ready for court." Because if they wanted a fight, they were about to get one. Over the next few weeks, I worked tirelessly. I gathered every instance of selective enforcement, every complaint ignored, every instance of bias. But the more I dug, the uglier it got. Neighbors who'd once smiled at me now avoided my gaze. Some even whispered as I passed. And then, the real harassment started. I woke up to find a warning notice on my door, falsely claiming I had unpaid HOA dues. The next day, a tow truck tried to impound my car for expired registration, except my tags were current. Then came the anonymous complaint to Child Services. A false report, claiming I was an unfit mother. That's when I knew they weren't just trying to intimidate me. They wanted to break me. But what they didn't know was that I had one final move left to play. And Ethan? He was about to change everything. The courtroom is packed. The polished wooden benches are lined with HOA board members, neighbors, and a few reporters who caught wind of the case. The air crackles with hushed whispers and concealed smirks. At the defendant's table, Calloway sits with his lawyer, looking relaxed. Too relaxed. I take my seat beside Ethan, who is eerily still, his fingers tapping lightly against his knee. Counting. Processing. Waiting. The judge enters, a stern woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense presence. This court is now in session. We are here today regarding the lawsuit brought by the Westbrook Estates Homeowners Association against Ms. Carter. Calloway's attorney stands first. A slick, corporate man in a tailored suit. Your Honor, this is a simple case. The defendant made an unapproved modification to her home, violating HOA bylaws. We are simply enforcing community standards. He sits, smug. I rise. Your Honor, my home modification, a wheelchair ramp, does not violate any bylaw. This is selective enforcement. The judge leans forward. Do you have proof of this claim, Ms. Carter? Ethan clears his throat. The courtroom stills. It's the first time he's spoken. If I may, Your Honor, he says, voice steady, I'd like to present some findings. The judge glances at me, then nods. Proceed. Ethan stands, adjusting his suit. He turns to Calloway and his lawyer, his gaze sharp. The HOA claims my mother's ramp was unapproved. But records show that multiple homes were modified in the past year, without written approval. He steps toward the judge, holding up a folder. Here are 6 documented cases of modifications, fences, extended porches, even a sunroom, all approved verbally. The judge takes the folder, flipping through it. A murmur rises in the courtroom. Calloway stiffens. His lawyer shifts uneasily. Additionally, Ethan continues, I analyzed HOA complaint response times. Complaints filed by white residents were addressed, on average, within 3 to 5 days. Complaints filed by black residents. He pauses. An average of 3 months, if they were addressed at all. The judge's gaze sharpens. Mr. Calloway, do you have an explanation for this discrepancy? Calloway clears his throat, his confidence faltering. These statistics are misleading. We prioritize based on urgency. Ethan tilts his head. So, a mailbox violation is urgent, but a broken streetlight near a black family's home isn't? Calloway's lawyer shifts again. This is anecdotal. It doesn't prove bias. Ethan nods. Then let's talk about the financial fraud. The room goes dead silent. Calloway's jaw tightens. Excuse me. Ethan pulls out another document. I cross-referenced HOA financial reports. There were multiple inconsistent fees charged exclusively to minority homeowners. My mother, for example, was charged extra fines that were never applied to others. I watch as Calloway loses color. And, Ethan says, delivering the final blow, I found an email. An internal HOA email sent by Mr. Calloway. He hands the paper to the judge, in which he refers to my mother as, Ethan's voice tightens, but he stays composed. A problematic resident who doesn't fit the community's vision. Gasps ripple through the room. The judge reads the email, then slowly looks up. Mr. Calloway, would you care to explain this? Calloway opens his mouth, then closes it. His lawyer frantically whispers something, but it's too late. The courtroom erupts. Reporters scribble notes. Neighbors murmur in shock. I look at Calloway. He thought this lawsuit would humiliate me, that it would push me out quietly. Instead, he just exposed himself. And the best part? We're not done yet. The courtroom is silent. Every eye in the room is on Calloway, his face frozen in shock. His lawyer whispers furiously, flipping through documents, but there's nothing, that can explain away the email Ethan just exposed. The judge's expression darkens as she schemes the page again. "Mr. Calloway," she says slowly, each syllable laced with quiet authority, "is this email authentic?" Calloway shifts in his seat. "Your Honor, this is a gross misinterpretation." "It's a direct quote," Ethan interjects, voice calm but razor-sharp. He's still standing, his posture straight, his hands folded neatly behind his back. Unshaken. "Would you like to see more?" The judge raises an eyebrow. "More?" Ethan nods. "Because I have more." The tension snaps. Calloway's lawyer pales. He knows they've lost. I watch Calloway grip the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "This is outrageous," he finally barks. "This kid is manipulating data, cherry-picking emails." Ethan tilts his head, unimpressed. "Are you saying it's fabricated?" Calloway pauses. Trapped. If he says yes, he's accusing the court of accepting false evidence. If he says no, he's admitting guilt. The judge leans forward. "Mr. Calloway, do you deny sending this email?" Calloway says nothing. The silence stretches, heavy and damning. Then, Ethan delivers the final blow. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce one last piece of evidence," he says, stepping over to my bag and pulling out a flash drive. I see Calloway stiffen. He doesn't know what's coming. Ethan walks up to the judge's clerk, handing over the drive. "This contains an audio recording from an HOA meeting last month. I used a public records request to obtain it." Calloway's eyes widen. The judge nods. "Play it." The clerk inserts the drive, and suddenly, Calloway's voice fills the courtroom. "We can't just let people like her start making changes. If we give an inch, they'll take a mile. We're already dealing with too many of them moving in." A collective gasp. A woman's voice. Margaret Tinsley. "She's not even married. Probably scamming the system. We should have rejected her application from the start." I hear my own sharp inhale. The entire room shifts. I knew they were discriminatory, but this? The recording continues. "The lawsuit will drain her. Single mother, no husband, she'll fold. They always do." My stomach twists. This was their plan all along. I glance at Calloway, and for the first time, he looks afraid. His lawyer snaps. "This is inadmissible. Who authorized this?" The judge doesn't even look at him. "It was obtained through a legal public records request." "Sit down, counselor." Calloway slams his fist on the table. "This is a smear campaign. That recording is out of context." The judge gives him a look. "Mr. Calloway, this is your voice, is it not?" He doesn't answer. "Is it or is it not?" she repeats. Calloway swallows hard. "Yes," he mutters. The judge leans back. "Then it speaks for itself." A murmur sweeps the courtroom. Reporters scribble notes furiously. Even the spectators, some of whom had probably sided with the HOA before today, look shaken. I can feel it. The power shift. Calloway glances at Margaret, whose face is drained of color. The rest of the HOA board members sink lower in their seats. They know they're finished. But Calloway isn't done fighting. "I refuse to be part of this witch hunt," he growls, shoving his chair back. He stands, trying to salvage his dignity. "This is nothing but a coordinated attack by an entitled woman and her." "Careful," the judge warns. He shuts up. Too late. The damage is done. The judge looks to me. "Ms. Carter, based on the evidence presented, it's clear this lawsuit is rooted in discrimination. I'm dismissing the case against you immediately." A wave of relief crashes over me. But the judge isn't finished. She turns to Calloway, her voice ice-cold. "Furthermore, given the evidence of financial misconduct and discriminatory practices, I am recommending an official investigation into the Westbrook Estates HOA. And I strongly suggest you secure legal counsel, because you're going to need it." Boom. The courtroom erupts. Reporters scramble to record the statement. Some HOA board members look ready to faint. Margaret grips the table, shaking. And Calloway. He's completely still. His empire, his power, his control, is crumbling around him. I meet his gaze. And for the first time in 5 years, he's the one who looks like he doesn't belong here. Calloway is gone. Resigned. Disgraced. Under investigation for financial fraud. Margaret, too. She tried to distance herself, but the emails, the recordings, they buried her. The entire HOA board collapsed under scrutiny. The state opened an inquiry, and soon, every shady financial transaction they'd ever made would come to light. It happened fast. 1 week after the trial, reporters swarmed the neighborhood. Headlines screamed about racial discrimination, corruption, and embezzlement. 2 weeks later, the HOA board members were formally removed. 3 weeks later, the HOA itself was dissolved. Westbrook Estates no longer had a homeowners association. We were free. The neighborhood reacts. At first, some of the neighbors avoided eye contact with me. The same people who had whispered behind my back. The same ones who had sided with Calloway, or worse, stayed silent. But then came the quiet acknowledgments. The older woman next door who nodded at me for the first time in years. The young couple across the street who left a plate of cookies on my porch. No note. Just a silent offering. And then came the apologies. One by one, neighbors knocked on my door. Some fumbled their words. Some admitted they hadn't wanted to believe that racism was still woven into the fabric of our community. But the hardest one, Mrs. Delacroix. She was one of the oldest residents. She'd been at every HOA meeting, sitting silently as Calloway and Margaret wielded their power. One evening, she stood on my porch, gripping her cane. I should have spoken up, she whispered, voice shaking. I saw it. I knew it. And I let it happen. I let her words settle. Let her discomfort linger. Then I said, "What matters is that you see it now." Her eyes watered. I do. Reclaiming our peace. Ethan and I sat on our front porch one evening, watching the sunset. The house was quiet. Peaceful. The ramp Calloway had fought so hard to remove. Still there. Ethan stretched his legs, letting the fading sunlight warm his face. "You know," he murmured, "part of me wants to say I told you so." I chuckled. "Go ahead. You earned it." He smiled, really smiled. 4 years, Calloway had tried to make us feel like we didn't belong. Like we weren't worthy of this neighborhood. But as I sat there, the summer air warm against my skin, I realized something. He was gone. We were still here. And we weren't going anywhere. 1 month later, a letter arrived. It was from the new Neighborhood Council, a volunteer group replacing the HOA. Inside was a note. Ms. Carter, in recognition of your perseverance and dedication to justice, we'd like to offer you a seat on the new advisory board. We believe Westbrook Estates should reflect all of its residents, fairly and equally. Your leadership would be invaluable. With respect, the Westbrook Estates Community Council. I exhaled slowly, reading the words again. Calloway had tried to silence us. Now, my voice was being asked for. I set the letter down, looking out the window at our home. Our home. And I smiled.